Good evening to you all. I hope you're all joining easily tonight and smoothly into our Zoom webinar for MerinoLink. We're very excited tonight to present this new format for MerinoLink. It's something that we've decided to do to add a bit of value for members and to just give some insights into our projects and their information. So they're the bits and pieces that we don't always see as members when a project's happening, but this hopefully gives you some insight into that and access to that as well. So we might kick off so that we're not eating into the girls' presentation time, but just to let you know too, this webinar tonight is being recorded because we're actually going to add cut out sections of the webinar onto the web page, which you would have all received in an email earlier. So this will be able to be rewatched by you. Questions you're welcome to ask at any point via the Q&A chat, or it's not a chat, it's just Q&A. And you're also welcome to raise your hand. We've just got a few online tonight, so it will be an easy interjection, and it'd be nice to ask it at the right time. So feel free to do that, and I'll monitor the Q&A if you wanted to type things in. If you raise your hand, it will be a verbal question, so it'll just take me a little time to get your microphone unmuted. So tonight we're really lucky to have the research experts that are running the PDS Preg scanning in extensive flocks project for MerinoLink and MLA. So I'll give you a brief intro to Laura and Sue. Welcome tonight. It's great to have you here. And then they'll explain the project and then run into the information. So Laura runs a consultancy business, which is called Productive Livestock Systems. She's based in Cootamundra of New South Wales, and she works with lots of different sheep producers to improve all aspects of their enterprise with a focus on nutrition, reproduction, of course, and genetics. And following close behind her is Sue, who's an expert and has been around has a great wealth of experience. She's worked as a scientist in the sheep and wool industries. Oh, it's for many years, that's a nice way to put it. She specialises in applied genetics, wool production and quality in sheep reproduction, and provides R&D and A consultancy services to corporate clients, but also sheep producers through her company Making Outcomes. Sue's based in Orange in the Central West, quite close to me in Bathurst. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Laura and we will step straight into the presentations. Feel free to ask questions as we go. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Emma, and good evening to everyone that's managed to join us. Thanks for coming along. This webinar is brought to you today by Meat Livestock Australia, and it's funded by the Community Demonstration Site Program, which is really focused on providing support to implement new technologies and practices on the farm, and to really try and demonstrate the benefits of those new practices in a real life context. So Sue and I are currently running a PDS project with producers in the Riverina and the Western Districts of New South Wales, using Preg scanning and other flock management techniques to improve reproduction rates in those extensive environments. And we'll be running that over the next 3 years. We have 4 demonstration sites. So one about 100 km north of Wentworth, we've got one northwest of Wilcannia, Hay and Darlington Point. And the project came about really in response to a national survey back in 2019, which showed that only about 50% of producers were using Preg scanning at all. 19% of those, 19% in total was scanning for wet and dry, and 31% was scanning for multiples. So not really that many. And in the survey, the reasons for not scanning included that they really did see the benefit, but it wasn't practical for their system, or they lacked the time and labour. And I understand that in extensive environments like those of our demonstration sites, it can be a real challenge to differentially manage ewes. So in that project, we're going to be investigating some more practical ways of implementing best practice management. And we'll capture data throughout that breeding cycle as well to evaluate costs and benefits of those strategies. There are a lot of different strategies available when you're trying to improve reproduction rates. And so in this webinar, we're going to be focusing on some of the key strategies that you can really take home and use regardless of your environment. So first, I'm going to touch on what data you really need to be collecting to monitor your reproduction rates and why that data is really important. Next, we'll look at the condition scoring and why it's a really important tool to use, as well as the impact of nutrition on reproduction rate, reproduction at different stages of the breeding cycle. I'll talk about why you need a really good understanding of your pastures to best manage the nutrition of your ewes. And I'll finally give some tips on managing joining. And I'll then hand over to Sue, who will talk about web scanning, including scanning for multiples and fetal aging, optimizing lambing mob size, the value in assessing wet and dry status at marking time, and how you can boost your breeding ewe numbers by retaining your best older ewes for an extra joining opportunity. This webinar will really focus on the key messages and trying to link them all together. So if you are interested in more detail, we've also compiled a list of resources like webinars and websites, which are available on the MerinoLink website, and you will receive access to that with your meeting invitation tonight. We've probably all heard the saying, you've got to measure something to be able to manage it, and the same is absolutely true for repro. And here's just one example of why that's the case. This is some land marking data from a property that doesn't historically Preg scan, and their average land marking percentage is 97%, which is certainly above the industry average of 92%. So you look at that and think that's fair enough, very respectable. But when you look at the marking percentage for individual mobs, it tells us a bit of an interesting story. It shows there's actually a really big gap between some of the best and some of the worst performing mobs, sometimes up to nearly 70%. So it's telling me this flock has quite, an enormous potential when it comes to land marking percentages, but that's only happening when the management and environmental conditions are favourable, and not all the different mobs are being given the same opportunity to express that potential. As an advisor or a producer, without knowing the reasons why those worst mobs are performing as they are, we really can't do anything to improve that situation. Because reproduction is affected by so many different factors, and most of these are environmental, we really need to collect some good quality data to get a good understanding of what our flocks are doing, to be able to start to detect those different trends and to work out the reason why something is or isn't happening. So the first step is to work out where those losses are occurring in the first place. Is it a failure to get ewes in laying? Are you simply just not getting pregnant? Are you dealing with diseases in late pregnancy? Are you losing lambs in those first few days or weeks of life? Or are you experiencing losses after marking or even? If you can pinpoint where these issues are occurring along this reproductive timeline, you can really start to impact on those by adjusting the management. And it's quite a simple task to really work out what the issues, where those issues are occurring. All you need to do is just record your ewe and lamb numbers throughout the breeding cycle and make sure you Preg scan the ewes. They really are simple records, but very powerful in hindsight, because it's only once you identify where those losses are occurring that you can start to manage those underlying issues. And also having that data is really going to help you prioritise what strategies you need to focus on. To monitor your reproductive performance, these are the records that are really quite useful. At joining, it's simply number of ewes joined, growth percentage, ewe condition score. Scanning, it's number of dries, singles, twins, and ewe condition score again. For lambing, I want to know how many ewes are going into that paddock, and other paddock conditions like how much feed is on offer, the quality of that feed, the shelter, privacy. At marking, I need to know how many ewes have survived through lambing and how many lambs are at marking. Condition score again is really important. And then at weaning, the count on the ewes and lambs, weaning weights would be ideal, and the condition score again. So that'd be, in my opinion, a fantastic standard to aim for, but even just recording accurate ewe and lamb numbers is a great start. And also make sure you do store that data somewhere that you can easily access it, and that it will allow you to make those comparisons between different mobs and between years. So put it into something like a simple spreadsheet rather than a notebook, because you want to try and minimise any of those challenges, any of those hurdles that are going to stop you from actually using that data. The key performance indicators you can then calculate from those records are your scanning rate, marking rate, lamb survival, and ewe mortality. You just want to make sure when you are comparing results for scanning rate or marking rate between mobs or between years, you should always calculate your results as a percentage of years joined. And the reason for that is that it reflects everything that's happened to those years up to that point in the breeding cycle. Some people talk about landmarking rates as a percentage of years scanned as pregnant, but this doesn't really give us the whole picture, and it does artificially inflate the marking percentage as well. So with Preg scanning, wet and dry scanning is useful in that it can monitor the number of dry ewes. It can help highlight issues with your rams or indicate whether there might be reproductive disease like brucellosis present. And you can use that information to cull dry ewes or to run them separately. In this example I've got here, in our first mob, we've got 10% of ewes that are scanned as dry and 6% in the second mob. So, a question for you, would you be happy with marking 90 or 95% lambs from each of those different mobs? It doesn't really sound too bad because it's one live lamb per pregnant ewe. But there's really a limit in what you can do with this information. The only outcome is really that you can cull a few more ewes from that first mob than the second mob. But in terms of management, you don't really know if you need to do anything differently with how you manage each of those mobs. Now, if those same two mobs were scanned for multiples, you can see there's actually some quite significant differences between them. So mob 1, we can now see is scanned with 35% multiples, and mob 2 is scanned with 45% multiples. And this equates to the 125 and 139 fetuses per 100 ewes joined, which means it's potentially 14% more lambs for mob 2 than mob 1. And that's a lot of extra mouths to feed and will have a really big impact on the energy requirements for that second mob. And so now knowing that you have either a potential 125 or 139 fetuses, which could be potential lambs, would you still be happy with that 90 or 95% marking rate? Because what that equates to is actually a loss of either 24 or 32% of lambs for each of those mobs. And it's a significant loss, but it's also a significant opportunity to improve production. By scanning for multiples, you'll actually be able to tell what your potential is, where those losses are occurring, and better yet, how to manage the ewes for the best outcome, which we'll explain a little bit later on. When you do scan for multiples and you land your ewes down in the Preg scan groups, so as singles or as twins, you can also start to then monitor lamb survival, which is another really important metric. All you need to do is record your lamb marking numbers for individual mobs and calculate lamb survival as the number of lambs marked divided by the number of fetuses scanned. So if we have 260 lambs marked from a 200 twin-bearing ewe mob, that will give us our 65% survival. Now, I do understand that logistics at marking can make it really challenging to try and collect data on individual mobs because often you box them, the contractors are pushing you to get through big numbers in a day. So if you must, try and only box singles with singles and twins with twins, and also keep the maidens separate to the adults, so you can still gather useful data to work out what's going on. And if it is possible to record lamb survival for those individual mobs, it's going to give you some really good feedback on the management of those mobs and your lamb paddock selection. Did you choose paddocks that had enough shelter for that mob? Was there enough feed? Is it high enough quality? Was ewe condition score adequate? And did you provide the right nutrition throughout pregnancy? Or are there any potential disease impacts that might be affecting your maidens rather than adults? And if you do this, you may find that lamb survival, particularly for twins, is your biggest opportunity to improve the production of your flock. Because at the moment it's estimated that only 70% of twin lambs survive to marking, and I know in some situations it's a lot worse than that. So it's a significant loss, but a significant opportunity as well. One of the other tricks I mentioned was condition scoring, and I really recommend recording this throughout the breeding cycle as well. It's quite similar to fat scoring, if you've heard of that, but this is done on the short ribs, just in front of the hip bones instead. And what you're doing in condition scoring is you're assessing the fat and muscle reserves in that loin chop region. And these cross-section diagrams show just how much that can change throughout the breeding cycle. The condition score scale goes from a 1 to 5, where a 1 is a very poor animal, emaciated, basically, and that's death score. And the condition score 5 is obese, and usually you only see that on a potty line. Most of the year with our commercial ewes, we want to aim for somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5. And in terms of actually doing the condition scoring, every time the ewes come into the yards for another management activity, you just need to assess 50 or so ewes, and that'll give you a really good idea of the average of the lot. And the reason I'd like you to measure condition score on the ewes is because it's the best indicator of a ewe's nutritional status. And nutrition is the most powerful tool we have to influence reproduction. It has an enormous impact on all of these different developmental stages in the pathway throughout pregnancy and lactation. It will determine whether a ewe will conceive and if she has or twins. It influences placental development, fetal growth, and survival of those lambs until weaning. And it even determines the lifetime wool production potential of that lamb. We can use the condition score of a ewe to tell us about her nutritional profile in the past and also to predict her reproduction outcomes in the future. And here's an example of what that relationship looks like between reproduction and condition score. As I just mentioned, the condition score of ewes at joining can determine the proportion of ewes that are going to be dry or conceive 1 or 2 lambs. And the higher the condition score, the more ewes are going to be getting pregnant, and the more ewes will be getting pregnant with twins. The impact of this is that for every extra condition score on the ewe of joining, you can get approximately a 20% increase in the number of fetuses that are scanned. Though it is important to note that this response is variable and you do need to measure it on your own farm. And Sue's going to tell you how to do this later. There are also a number of ways that condition score of a ewe influences lamb survival. And it does this through increasing lamb birth weight as condition score increases. This is especially true for twins. A good condition score helps support milk production, which is of course important for lamb growth. If the ewe is too low or too high in condition score, that can affect the birth process. And again, if you're either end of that extreme scale, you can have a much higher risk of ewe mortality. When you put that all together, have a look at the twin lamb survival in particular. Even small increases in that condition score of the ewe can have a really significant impact on lamb survival. So even if we go from say 2.5 to 3, that's equivalent to about a 7% increase in lamb survival, which would be 14 extra lambs per 100 twin-bearing ewes that are laying down. And to achieve that condition score increase doesn't just mean supplementary feeding either. You could achieve it just by allocating the best paddocks to those twin-bearing ewes, because we can see that the singles still do quite well even if they're treated a little bit later. So what do you need to be aiming for with condition score? More is not always better. Singles that are too fat at lambing are going to have real issues with lambs getting stuck, and likewise twin-bearing ewes are going to be much more likely to suffer from pregnancy diseases like Preg or milk fever if they're too fat. The optimum target's really going to depend on your own property and your own circumstances. Factors like the time of joining, your environment, feed supply, and breed of sheep all come into play. So you really need to be able to track condition score throughout the breeding cycle for yourself and monitor your reproduction outcomes, because this is going to give you the best feedback on your nutritional management of the ewes and will help you set targets to optimise your own landing rates in the future. In general though, for winter and spring lambing flocks, you should be aiming for a condition score 3 or more at joining, because the higher the condition score, the better the joining rates. For mid-pregnancy, it's around scanning time. You want to be targeting 2.8 to 3, because that'll allow for that component of nutrition in late pregnancy, but the ewes also won't be getting too fat. We also don't want it too low at that time, because then you might not be able to achieve those higher targets for lambing. For the lambing targets, we have those different targets for singles and twins, with the twins about 0.3 with the condition score higher. And that's the case because both have very different nutritional requirements to ensure that not only the survival is optimal for the lamb, but also for the ewe. I just want to highlight that you can't achieve these different targets while managing single and twin brain ewes in the same line. They must be managed differentially from mid-pregnancy onwards, and Sue's going to explain this a bit more later. The other thing you need to remember is that it takes some time for condition score to change, so we need to be planning really well ahead of time. At joining, we need to be thinking about the scanning target. Scanning, we've got to be thinking about the landing target. Also, don't be daunted by it. Condition scoring is a really simple tool that anyone can learn. And so if you are interested, I'd encourage you to take part in a lifetime management course or to find an advisor that can help teach you. And of course, to successfully manage your nutrition and achieve those condition score targets, you really need a good understanding of your pastures, both in terms of the quantity and the quality. Developing really good visual assessment skills so you can accurately estimate the value of feed is going to help you make much better decisions when allocating mobs to paddocks and deciding when to supplement your feed or stock. For example, just have a look at how the energy content of the pastures can decline really rapidly after flowering. In a situation where you might be weaning in October and joining again in February, the question is, will the quality of that feed be sufficient for the ewes to reach that condition score 3 target for joining? We know at weaning time they're going to be down a fair bit. They might only be the 2.5 condition score, so they've got a fair bit of weight to put on to be ready for joining again. We know that a dry ewe, a 60 kilo dry ewe, might need 9.6 megajoules of energy per day. And if we're looking at the pastures in, say, December, they're worth about 8 to 9 megajoules of energy per kilo. So, yeah, we can work out she's probably going to be able to eat enough to meet her requirements and hopefully gain some of that weight back. If we move on to February, though, when the feed is completely dried off, it may only be worth about 5.5 megajoules of energy per kilo of dry matter at that stage. So it's probably not going to be enough for her to get what she needs out of it, and she's quite likely to go backwards at that stage. But knowing that, you can easily come in and be prepared with your supplementary feeding program to maintain that ewe's condition before any weight loss starts to happen, and you'll ensure a successful joining. And all this information here on the slide, this is all freely available from the Lifetime Wool website. They also provide feed budget tables to work out how much energy the ewes will get from the pasture. So it's a really good resource, and I encourage you to have a look at the tools they've got available there. Now, moving on to joining management. Joining length is a really important one because it's got implications for how you manage those ewes for the rest of the breeding cycle. A concise joining period is really beneficial because ewes have much more similar feed requirements, which will really help in trying to achieve those condition score targets. A shorter lambing period also means you've got that narrow age range for lambs, so they'll be a lot easier to manage at marking and weaning. And because they're all a lot younger, or more similar age, you can actually wean at a better time, which will give even more time for the ewes to recover their condition for joining the following year. So if you're joining after late January, provided ewes are in reasonable condition, about 95% of ewes should join in those first 2 cycles, 34 days. If you're joining any longer than those first 2 cycles, you will get a few extra lambs, but it just needs to be weighed up against the impact that those lambs will have by delaying marking and weaning operations. Because if you are weaning a little bit later, it might mean that your ewes just don't have enough time to recover condition for joining next time, which will reduce the chance to conceive, and they'll just join later again, and it'll just be a self-perpetuating issue. If you find that you're joining for more than 6 weeks, and you are joining that late January period or even later, and if you've got quite a few lambs that are arriving in those last 2 weeks of lambing, you might need to investigate why that's happening, because they really should be getting pregnant earlier than that. If you're joining before late January though, A longer joining period might be warranted if the ewes are not cycling due to seasonal animal stress. And in this case, fetal aging might be appropriate to help manage the nutrition for those ewes, and so we'll touch on this a bit later. Now, in regards to the rams, with the ram joining percentage, the industry recommendations are for mature ewes, we want 1% plus 1. For maidens, it's 1.5%. For ewe lambs, it's 2%. But in extensive environments, you really might want to be increasing those numbers to make sure you're getting good ewe-ram contact, particularly if you've got perhaps different watering points or you're finding that the mobs are splitting up over a fair distance. You'll also definitely need to increase those ram numbers if you're using teasers, just to make sure that the rams can actually cover the high number of ewes that are cycling each day. It's also really important to do a reproductive soundness exam 8 to 12 weeks before you join, because any issues that you find that could affect sperm production, like a fly strike or a foot abscess, well, that ram will need a full 8 weeks to recover and for that new functional sperm to be produced. So it's not much good doing it a month out before joining. When you're doing that exam, we've now got the 5 T's. We seem to keep getting more of this every year or so. 5 T's would be the tackle, testes, toes, teeth, and torso being condition score. And there are quite a few vets around now that actually help them do these reproductive exams. And I really encourage you to suss that out because you can learn a lot from them. And they pick up a lot that most of us wouldn't when you're not doing this every day. The condition score target for the rams is a really important one as well. And you really need to spend the time to prepare them well ahead of joining. Because if you have that condition score target, which a lot of rams are, because they're not doing any work most of the year, you're basically asking a couch potato to go out and run a marathon. So it's not going to go too well. Also, don't forget to test for worms and drench if needed. Now, when you're joining maidens, generally the higher the joining live weight, the more ewes will actually conceive. Condition scores are a really important factor as well, but just remember, we're aiming for fit, not fat ewes. For ewes that are joined as a 1.5-year-old, the minimum target live weight should be 80% of their mature weight. And with a mature weight, that's their standard reference weight. So that's their weight as an adult in condition score 3 with no fleece and no gut filling. For the ewe lambs, we're aiming for a minimum of 4 to 5 kilos or 70% of their mature weight, whichever is higher. But this is really still an emerging practice and we're learning a lot about it as we go. So you really need to be measuring it and monitoring the outcomes on your own farm. For ewe lambs, the age of the lamb is also really important because it determines when the lamb will go through puberty. And there's a great webinar by Nathan Scott on Sheep Connect about that ewe lamb join. And we've included this in the MerinoLink website page for the extra resources. So that's all from me. Thank you. And I'll hand over to Sue.
Here I am. Thank you, Laura. I'll just share my screen. That one? Yep. So thank you. So I'll be presenting the second half of the webinar tonight. I'll be picking up on some of the information that Laura's been talking to you about. So again, I really want to highlight the point that it's ewe nutrition that really drives reproductive efficiency. All of the reproductive traits like number of lambs weaned, litter size, conception, they're all quite lowly heritable. And that means that while they do have a genetic component, it's mostly the environment and the management in which we run our sheep that's going to really direct the outcomes in terms of reproduction. And you can see here that ewe nutrition flows all the way through. So for ewes, it affects their fecundity, their fertility, embryo survival, fetal development, fetal growth, and that directly impacts on the birth weight and body reserves of the lambs at birth. Ewe nutrition also really affects the ease of parturition, whether it's a quick or slow birth process, and also the behaviour. And we all know it's really important for those ewes and lambs to have a really strong bond between them and that's driven by behaviour of the ewe and the lamb to make sure they have that strong bond, which sets them up for success as a unit to work together towards weaning. And we know that also ewe nutrition has an impact on the body reserves, flows down to lamb behaviour to make sure the lamb is vital, calls, follows its mother and retains her interest, particularly for twin-born lambs. And then those lamb traits that are affected by ewe nutrition flow directly into the weaner traits in terms of weaning weight and weaner growth. And we know they're both really key traits to hit your net reproductive rate or number of lambs weaned per ewe joined. So ewe reproduction is really important, and we can manage that by using some of the tools that Laura's told you about, by condition scoring and by looking at your pasture and matching them up and supplementing when required, and using those tools that she was talking about on the Lifetime Wool website to make sure ewes have got adequate nutrition. And we know that twin-bearing ewes and their lambs have a higher risk of mortality compared to singles. So this is a diagram I've adapted from a recent review about dystocia and lamb loss in sheep. And you can see that based on about a 20% average lamb mortality, which is a little bit lower than the expectation. So some of the percentages here might be a little bit on the conservative side. But you can see that with our pregnant ewe, roughly you might get about 75 to 80% of live lambs, and that's exactly what we're after. That's the situation we want to push towards with our management of our ewe during pregnancy and up to lambing. And our dead lambs can be about between 15 and 22%, but also can be higher, again, if you have adverse weather conditions and if your management isn't up to scratch. And then you can see you've got those three major causes of lamb mortality. We've got dystocia, starvation, mismothering exposure, and predation, infection and cold exposure. But the major ones here are dystocia and starvation and mismothering. And you can see in the yellow shaded box there that the internal factors, it's ewe nutrition that Laura was talking about, live weight, condition score, the ewe parity, how many pregnancies she's had and her age. Breed also has a fact. We have purebreds, and some of them have different reproductive capacity. And if we go to crossbreeding, that hybrid vigor gives us increased reproductive capacity as well. And then we have the lamb factors, I guess. So the birth weight, the sex, the shape of the lamb, and the litter size could all impact directly as internal factors on lamb mortality. And then we have the external factors, things like estrogenic clovers, like Preg tox and hypocalcemia, that can also impact upon maternal dystocia in particular and contribute to lamb loss. And I guess one of the big factors about dystocia and why it's quite a big research focus for the industry at the moment is you get lamb loss from dystocia, but you also can get a significant amount of ewe loss as well, which can have a significant impact on your flock profitability, because obviously a dead ewe is not going to get it pregnant for you again. So one of the ways we need to think about is really actively managing our ewes based on what they're carrying, based on whether they're dry, whether they're single, or whether they're carrying a twin or even more higher order multiples. So pregnancy scanning is a really effective tool to allow you to do that, to really understand what's going on in your flock so you know how to manage them adequately. And I think the first thing we can do for pregnancy scanning is to remove the dry ewes, because you can cull them from your flock and sell them. If they've got really good wool producers, you can maintain them as a dry sheep for wool production, help manage some of your grazing management to get your perhaps weaner and lambing pastures ready to go. But really, if all you're doing by keeping your dry ewes in with your breeding ewe mob is you're just giving them more competition. So you're making the ewes with the high nutritional requirements compete with others unnecessarily to get those requirements from the pasture or the feed. So removing your dry ewes is a really good strategy. And then once you've identified whether you've got twins or singles in your flock and how many you've got, it's really important to differentially manage them, because as I'll show you in a second, their nutritional requirements are significantly different and they're not the same sheep at all. So managing nutrition during pregnancy is important. You want to manage the fatness of your single-bearing ewes and make sure your twin-bearing ewes have got adequate nutrition. And then as we move into lambing, you can allocate your lambing paddocks. So give your best paddocks with the best shelter, the best feed, and good access to water to your twin-bearing ewes or your most high-risk ewes. You can muster your twin-bearing ewes into your lambing paddocks before your singles, and you can set your mob size, which I'll show you can have an impact on lamb survival as well. And if we differentially manage our pregnant ewes based on their pregnancy status, we can help to reduce ewe mortality, we can increase lamb survival, and we can reduce our overall feed costs because we're targeting the feed to exactly which ewes are going to be needing it. It's really important to set yourself and your scanner up for efficient and effective scanning, okay? So it's really important. You want the scanner to come at that time. You want to really plan to scan at about 70 days from when you put the rams in. But of course, if everyone else is joining at the same time, there's going to be a real rush for scanners at the same time. So make sure when you put your rams in, go home that night, ring your scanner and book them in for the job. So as I said, you want to plan to scan at 70 days from the start of joining. There is a bit of a range there from about day 80 to day 100. In the earlier, it's hard to pick up the pregnancy, and any later, it's just really hard to differentiate the number of fetuses that are in there. The Sheep CRC did a lot of work on preg scanning accuracy, and there's been some more recent work. What that work is telling us is to note not to feed any supplements, whether it's grain, hay or silage, the day before scanning, and remove the ewes from feed overnight. It's really important to talk to your scanner about what the realistic numbers are for scanning, and we'll know in terms of what they can do per day with accuracy. We know wet and drying is fast, we know multiples takes longer, and we know fetal aging takes a little longer as well. So long as both parties understand what's required and how many ewes we can work through in a day. Prepare your yards, so make sure your yards are functional, you get good movement of sheep through, and if you're planning on drafting into the pregnancy groups, make sure you've got available space to do so. And really make sure you have enough help on board to just keep everything running smoothly for you and the scanner. So let's again get back to why differentially managing your single and twin bearing ewes is important. So this graph here is showing you the maintenance energy requirements on the vertical axis versus the days from joining. Now the yellow line is dry ewes. Now you can see that their maintenance energy requirements, that ticks along, pretty steadily at about 7 megajoules per day. It doesn't really change. The black line is the single bearing ewes energy requirements, and the green line is twin bearing ewes. And you can see that about, here we are at about day 70, about when we're starting to think about getting this, we want to get the scanner in to do the job. You can see that that's where the energy requirements of the single and the twin bearing ewes start to split apart. And that's why it's the perfect time from pregnancy scanning onto lambing is to differentially manage those ewes. You can see from scanning until the point of lambing that twin bearing ewes, our green line, they require about 15% more energy than single bearing ewes. And once the lambs hit the ground and they've got that high energy requirement of lactation, you can see those energy requirements jump up to 25%. So very clearly that twin and single bearing ewes aren't the same animals. They have quite different energy requirements, and their performance will depend on those energy requirements being fulfilled. And of course, they have different protein requirements as well, but energy is what's going to drive the system. So this is, again, coming back to what Laura showed you. So it's really important to know how many dry singles and twins you have in your flock. Then you'll know, how to set things up, how to plan for how many lambing paddocks you need, and how to manage them for efficiency. And as you can see, the dries in this case is the grey line, and that's usually pretty consistent across all condition scores. And as Laura showed you, as the condition score pre-joining increases, we have a decreased proportion of ewes carrying singles and an increased proportion of ewes carrying twins. In some flocks, depending on where the lines cross, there is some variation between flocks. More upwards of 60% of ewes could be carrying twins, and that's a risk for survival. But it's also, you need to really know who those ewes are to be able to manage their nutrition to match their needs during pregnancy. So what is the problem with twins? They are at higher risk. So what is it about twins? We know that twin-born lamb mortality is generally about 2 to 2.5 times higher than singles. So compared to single-born lambs, twin-born lambs have a higher risk of malpresentation because they're tangled up in there with someone else, and they have lighter birth weights. We know they have poor thermoregulatory capacity, so not able to monitor and maintain their body temperature the same way a single-born lamb can. They also have really small energy reserves, which means they're less vigorous, which means they're not going to be able to bleed and move around and attract and retain the interest of their ewe, which is really important to format that ewe-lamb bond. They have a larger surface area to volume ratio, which means they can lose heat really quickly to the environment. So when they're born, before they get fully dry, if a cold snap comes through, they can lose heat really quickly. They have access to about a third of the milk supply of a single-born ewe. So twin-bearing ewes don't produce twice as much milk as a single ewe does, and that means that each twin is getting about a third less milk than what a single-born lamb is. And that leads to slower pre-weaning growth rates, a faster transition across to pasture, which puts them at risk of worms, and also an increased exposure to worms. And they tend to also have a reduced disease resistance. So there's nothing really special, for all these changes is driven by the fact that they are smaller and that they have to compete with a litter mate from conception to weaning. They've got to compete with someone else and they're smaller, and that's what's driving all this change. So we've talked about why you would manage singles and twins separately to meet their nutritional requirements. And as Laura has already touched on, that with an extended joining, we know that fetal ageing might be an important tool for you to use as well. So we know that, and the industry recommendation, as Laura said, is to have that 2 17-day cycle joining. Because we know that in that first 17-day cycle, around about 75% of your ewes will conceive, provided they're hitting those condition score targets at joining. And we've got it, that's because about 6% of the ewes in your flock will be in estrus per day. As we go into the second 17-day cycle, the number of ewes in estrus drops down, and so you're going to have fewer ewes conceiving. And by the time you get to that third 17-day cycle, even if we can continue it on, there's really a small proportion of ewes cycling in your flock, and so there's really not going to be any benefit in having a longer joining. What effect is it going to do is it's going to extend out the lambing period. It's going to actually increase the age difference between your lambs, and you're going to have a longer tail of lambs of those smaller lambs. And once they get to weaning, that's the tail of your weaning mob will be really hard to manage anyway. So we recommend, that's why we recommend that 2 17-day joining cycle. But if for some reason, like Laura said, if you're joining out of season, you might want to have an extended joining. And in this instance, fetal ageing can be a really important tool to let you know who are the ones that conceived on that first or second cycle and which ewes conceived at later cycles. And then we can use that to manage them as we go forward. It's also important for fetal ageing if you've got an extended joining, but also if you've got lots of singles, because it's really important with lots of singles is to manage the condition score up to joining. Now the graphs on this chart, this is showing you the impact of birth weight on survival at lambing. So this is at the day of, or survival at birth. The graph that Laura showed you, they have a much steeper curve, and that shows you survival at weaning. But this is some work I did from data from the Trangie Research Station. And so what we did is we broke it down into survival at birth, survival at 7 days, survival to marking, and survival to weaning. And when we looked at survival to weaning, we found exactly the same curves that Laura showed you before. What I want to show you here is this is survival at birth. And you can see that for twin lambs at the top, sorry, single-born lambs at the top and twin-born. So survival at birth, it's a much flatter curve. And what we did is we calculated what was the average birth weight for these animals, but also the optimum birth weight where most of them survived. And you can see that the average birth weight is where we have either the open diamond for the singles. Sorry, no, we don't. It's the closed one is the average, and it's the open diamond is the optimum. And you can see that for single-born lambs, there's really no difference between the average survival at birth and the birth weight for average survival and the birth weight for optimal survival. Whereas if you see when we get down to twins, that difference between average birth weight and birth weight for optimal survival gets a little bit wider. So you've got room to move. And if I had showed you a graph with multiples, there's a bigger difference again. But the important thing here is there's not a lot of room to move to singles. So while, as Laura showed you, a higher birth weight is advantageous for survival to weaning, they've actually got to survive the birth process first. And so it's really important if you've got lots of singles, you want to stop those single-bearing ewes from getting too fat, or you'll run into the position where you'll have, you'll not only will that give your ewes a slower parturition, a slower birth process, which leads to more potential for hypoxia damage to the lamb, but you're also going to get higher lamb birth weights, which again will converge into dystocia and birth injury. And so using fetal aging is a really good tool in this situation to narrow that lamb age range, manage the singles better so you're not getting too heavy with the ewes, but also flows through to easier weaning management for you at weaning time. Pregnancy scanning also, as Laura showed you, it can really help you understand how responsive your flock is. So the across the lifetime wool project, the average across that sort of research project was about 20 extra lambs born per additional condition score at joining, as Laura said. But when you look at the individual flocks, you can see there's quite a big variation in performance between flocks. So you can have a low response. So you can have another very steep line. So like the black line or the yellow or the gold line. So what the black line is showing you is that for every extra condition score at joining, you're only getting an extra 4 lambs. But what's happening here is the black lines are a really low base. So that way you'd be looking at perhaps things about why aren't you ewes conceiving? You'd be having a look at your rams or something like that. But up here with, again, the yellow line, again, we're only getting 4 extra lambs per extra condition score at joining, but the line's really flat. So if you're a lowly responsive flock like this one, you're probably better off not focusing more of your effort in towards the management of late pregnancy and lambing rather than that sort of weaning to joining period, because your ewes aren't very responsive to an increase in condition score. Whereas if you look at the grey line that's really steep, you can see that's going to give you 24 extra lambs per condition score at joining. And for that flock, it's really worthwhile just focusing on that weaning to joining period, recovering your condition score so you can be up here at the higher fetal scanning percentages. So how do you do that? It's a simple process. So at joining, just randomly tag and condition score about 20 randomly selected ewes. So pick them at random. Don't pick the fattest ones. Don't pick the skinny ones. Pick them at random. So tag them, record their condition scoring, and save that information. When the ewes come around again at pregnancy scanning time, record their preg status, whether they're carrying a single, a twin, or whether they're dry. And then there's a calculator that used to be available on DPI's website, but I'll find it, I'll dig it up, and I'll make it available on the MerinoLink webpage that accompanies this webinar. That you can feed information into that calculator, it will tell you how responsive your flock is. And you can see that, depending on where you sit, if you've got a highly responsive flock down this end, as I said, you can move your focus from that weaning to joining period and put most of your effort in making sure that those lambs you've got scanned, you can maintain and get them to survive to 3 lambing and to weaning. If you've got a not very responsive flock, you might need to think about maybe some sort of veterinary assistance to make sure there's no underlying health problem, or just look at your rams and use to increase your fertility, and make sure you focus your effort on that during that weaning to joining period. So that's a couple of different uses of preg scanning information, and I'll touch on it again in a little while, another use we have of the information. But one of the other tools we can use to help improve twin lamb survival in particular is to look at mob size during lambing. So this graph is the outcome of a large study of over 70 different sites across Australia that was undertaken by Murdoch University and their project partners across Australia. And it's just looking at the impact of reducing mob size on twin lamb survival. So we know twin lamb survival, again, is really important. But one of the key things that this project has shown us is that lambing ewes occupy about 45% of the paddock. And it doesn't matter whether they're singles or twin bearing ewes, they're using less than half of the paddock. And it's nothing to do with stocking rate or sheep density. It then becomes the lambing density. So how many lambs are born per hectare per day? And we know that the lambing density of twin born lambs will be twice as high as singles. And when you have lots of lambs born on a day and lots of ewes giving birth to those lambs, there's a lot of potential for mismothering, and that's where we have some issues with lamb survival. So this project has shown us that across all of those sites, that there's a relationship of about, for every 100 ewes less in the twin bearing flock, survival to marking increases by about 2%. So you can see that's consistent. The green lines on the bottom, this is for merino ewes, and the grey line above is for non-merino ewes. So the relationship's consistent regardless of the breed of the ewe. but it's really important to understand that it's quite variable. Okay, so there were 70 sites around Australia, different environments, different production systems, different paddock sizes, all that kind of thing, which can drive some of this variation. So while the overall increase in landmarking percentage was 2%, it was quite variable. And that's what I just want to highlight to you in the table across here on the right. This is lamb survival from the mob size of 70 ewes. For Merinos, it varied between 50 to 95%, and the mob size of 200 ewes varied between 55 to 94%. So there was quite a bit of crossover. So this is another good thing to just have a try and see if it works. If you've identified by collecting your data the way that Laura showed you before about benchmarking your flock, and if you've found that lamb survival in twins is an issue for you, have a look and do a little experiment on your place. Try reducing mob size and seeing if that's the pinch point for you. Now, other assessment is another really good tool to use to help you benchmark and understand what's going on in your flock. And there's a couple of really good resources you can use. There's a YouTube video that one of my former colleagues, Gordon Murphy at Cara, put together. And there's also a sheep udder assessment at landmarking prime factor the field was twin I was at DPI put together. And that really gives you a step-by-step process of how to go about it. And I'll make sure the links to both of these are on that MerinoLink website. So wet and dry ewes at marking is a really important technique to help you understand which ewes are rearing the lambs. And as I'll show you in a little while, is we can combine that with our preg scanning information to find out who the ewes are that are getting pregnant and rearing their lambs, and we can make our selection decisions based on those. It's really important to wet and dry at marking. And as Laura said, we understand that marking is a really busy time on the property, but particularly for twin bearing ewes, as I'll show you in a second, is your most highly productive ewes, which generally are the ones that have twin bearers, they actually wean their lambs earlier. And so if you actually wait until weaning to wet and dry your ewes, you might find that you're thinking a twin bearing ewe that weaned early is dry or she's lambed and lost. And so you might be unfairly penalising those highly productive ewes for you. So it's really important to do that wet and drying at marking. And this, I guess, is one graph that shows you why. So the twins are the dashed lines. These are the twins here, the dashed line, and the singles are the solid lines. Now, milk intake is in grey and pasture intake is in green. Now, what I want you to focus on is where those lines intersect. Okay, so you can see, and that's where weeks from birth, the lambs are getting more feed from the pasture compared to getting feed they're getting more nutrition and energy from pasture than what they're getting from the milk. And you can see that the twins actually make that transition a little bit earlier than singles, because again, they're competing. As I said, they're getting about a third less milk, and they just do transition faster. So that means that, again, that's one of those reasons why if you wait until weaning later on, you might find that you might mistakenly think that one of your twin bearing ewes that's raised her lambs, you might think she's actually lambed and lost. So it's really important to do that lamb udder assessment at marking. And another key thing we can do to help build up numbers and improve our reproduction rate, and particularly at the moment when we're trying to source stock to rebuild flock numbers when the price of replacement ewes is just out of this world, is we can actually combine our preg scanning information with our wet and drying information to help us make selection decisions on our farm. So we know that even though I said that reproductive performance is lowly heritable and mostly driven by the environment, it is a highly repeatable trait. So we know that ewes that are successful at reproducing at early ages will be successful at reproducing at later ages. This is some work that Greg Lee and Kevin Atkins did a while ago now. And the table just shows you the performance at 2 and 3 years of age. So 2 years and 3 years of age. Were the ewes dry twice? Did they lamb once, or did they lamb twice? And then the data in the table shows you the performance of those same ewes at 4, 5, and 6 years of age, the rest of their normal productive life. So you can see that let's just focus on our net reproductive rate down the bottom, the number of lambs weaned per ewes joined. So for the ewes that were dry twice at 2 and 3 years of age, they were weaning less than 50% of their lambs when they were 4, 5 and 6 years of age. If we compare that to the ewes that lamb twice at 2 and 3 years of age, look at these girls. They're weaning 91% of their lambs for the rest of their life. And that's no mean feat, because look, they're more fertile, they've got higher litter sizes, and they've got higher survival. So the ewes that lamb twice, they're having more twins, and even though they're having more twins, they're still more than 91% of them are surviving. And so it's really good. We can predict our lifetime success by this early reproductive performance, and then we will know then that we have some highly productive ewes in our flock. And if we can keep those for an extra 1, maybe 2 lambing opportunities, it's a good way to increase numbers with proven performers in your flock. So I'm not saying keep all of your old ewes. We want to aim for about, maybe consider retaining 50% of your older ewes to join again. But if we're going to do that, you need to really have a look at those key fitness indicators. And udder soundness is really essential. So again, really tip the ewes over, tip all the older ewes over before you're planning on joining them again, and have a good look at their udders. There's good information in that prime fact I talked about before on what to look for. So this is some work that was done a while ago now on some Merino sheep up in Queensland, and it just shows you the difference in performance between the sound udder and the damaged udder in terms of milk yield, lamb survival, lamb growth rate, lamb marking weight. So you can see that the sound udders, ewes with sound udders, they produce more milk, higher lamb survival, the lambs are going to grow faster, and they're going to have a higher lamb marking weight. There's been a lot of recent research come out of Massey University in the last 18 months or so. They found exactly the same thing with Romney ewes. So this udder soundness is essential. The importance of teeth and feet will vary with the environment. But if you're any doubt at all, if you're thinking, oh, I'm not sure about her feet, or I'm not sure about her udders, any doubt at all, cull the ewe. Only keep ones you're confident of that they are sound. And if you are keeping your older ewes, sometimes I've had some feedback. You might think about which rams to join them to. And perhaps if you're retaining that older age group of ram ewes, maybe join them to a Merinos. If you do use a terminal, maybe put the terminal over those 5 or 6 years of year old ewes instead, just to make sure that those crossbred lambs don't put too much pressure on the system. And use best practice twin bearing ewe management for your older ewes. I want to just sort of bring us back here to measure to manage again. So collecting information to inform your decisions. Understand how responsive your flock is to that condition score at joining. If you're consistently getting high scanning rates but low lamb survival, low marking rates, low weaning rates, shift your focus from pre-joining into lambing. Maybe drop your scanning rates down a little bit more, and try and improve your lamb survival so we're not getting so much wastage. And again, collect the information that Laura talked about before, benchmark your system and identify where you can make the most gain in net reproduction rate and when you could do it. There's a lot of different tools out there, and they're not always going to be the same for everyone because everyone's flock's a little bit different. So it's important to collect the information, benchmark your flock, and identify what you can do to make the greatest gain and when you can do it. And I'll hand you over to Emma. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. What a lot of information we've just received. I just wanted to refer you all to the last slide that Sue's sharing with us at the moment, which is the website that I've sent the link through to all the registered attendees. You'll be able to use a password that was also included in that to log into that website, and all the resources that Sue and Laura have referred to tonight are listed on there in some sort of sectioning. So you might have to have a little hunt around, but I'm sure you'll find it. And if you've got any questions beyond that, then feel free to send us an email or give us a call, where I can definitely put you straight in touch. But now's the time to ask any questions if people would like to raise their hand or pop it into the Q&A box. But Sue, I've got one to start us off. I noticed with the Preg scanning days from joining, there was a bit of a range in there. Can you explain that a little bit and maybe give some advice in terms of speaking to your scanner?
Yeah, so too early is bad, but too late is bad as well. So if it's too late, it's hard for them to correctly identify how many fetuses are in there.
Sure.
And it's just you want to really give the scanner the best opportunity to do the job. So going too early or too late, it puts a lot of pressure on them, and it really does affect the accuracy. So you want to aim for that best practice time. And as I said, if everyone's joining at the same time, everyone's going to want scanners at the same time. Okay. So it's just one of those things. The day you put the RAMs out, you go back home, you ring and book your scanner up. So just one of those things you do and plan ahead.
That's a great idea, to book it early, and then they can advise you, you know, a day or two to shuffle it round. Doesn't matter, but they can certainly hit that range, can't they? Yeah, I know it depends. You know, some scanners like to go closer to the 80 days and some will be happy to sit it out a bit further, but yeah, it would depend on their experience and everything as well.
Right.
Too. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions while we're here? I'm looking at another screen now as well, so excuse me glancing away. Laura, did you have anything that you wanted to add at this point?
At this stage, I just probably can't emphasize enough the importance of just getting some accurate data together, because even for a lot of people, just getting accurate year and land numbers at marking is a real challenge. With some clients of mine, you know, we've had issues before trying to even estimate year mortality, because, you know, the numbers that they've got are different to what the contractors have got. So sometimes it's best to, you know, just take one time of the year, like shearing, and just get a really accurate count and take the time and do some recounts if needed, because it's, you know, accurate numbers, you can't do anything without them.
No, and I really like Sue's idea of taking the 200 randoms and, you know, following them through and tracking that. So that works. That's a great little tool. So Sue, did you have anything you wanted to add at this point? I'm conscious that we're right on time, so we probably shouldn't be too chatty.
No, I think just the whole measure to manage is really important. It works for your breeding ewes, and it's also equally important for when you're managing your weaners up to weaning and post-weaning growth rates as well. And I think also is you know, start planning from weaning. So start planning from weaning and then plan ahead. So from weaning, you should be knowing which your joining paddocks are. You should be knowing what your lambing paddocks are and what your weaning paddocks are, so you can manage ahead, and you can manage feed supply, and you can manage worm control, all those things as well. So just planning ahead, and that just gives you more flexibility too if something goes wrong.
Sure.
So if you're just reacting to things all the time, it's really hard and you find yourself in a bit of a ditch. But if you plan ahead and use the information to drive your decisions, it really helps as a risk management strategy for the year.
That's fantastic. Thank you. All right. Well, we haven't got any questions sitting in the Q&A. So I've got one more thing I'd like to add. We're really looking forward to seeing some of the producers go through this project and some of their learnings. So just for the benefit of attendees and people watching on later, we're hoping to have some producers profiles run at the conference for MerinoLink, which is in June in Wagga this year. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and they'll certainly be on the program if we can work it, and they all have a great season. So thanks again, Laura and Sue, and thanks to everyone online tonight, and good luck to everybody looking through the resources, and we'll see you again in the future. See you later.
Good night.
Bye.